The summer sun was just beginning to set as James pulled his rental car into the last available spot outside the Blue Daisy restaurant. He switched off the engine and checked his reflection in the rearview mirror, running a hand over his short beard. The drive from Chicago had been longer than expected, and his shoulders felt tight after 6 hours on the road. Finally, he whispered to himself, pocketing his car keys. After 10 months of back-to-back projects and late nights at his architecture firm, this vacation was long overdue. The small town of Millfield hadn't been his first choice. Most of his friends had suggested beach resorts or big cities, but something about this quiet historic town, with buildings dating back to the 1800s, had caught his eye. As an architect, he had a soft spot for places where you could still see the layers of history in the brickwork and design. James stepped out of his car and stretched his arms overhead, breathing in the unfamiliar air. It smelled different here, less exhaust and more like freshly cut grass, with hints of something sweet from a nearby bakery. A couple walked past him on the sidewalk, nodding with small-town friendliness. He nodded back, already feeling some of the city tension melt away. The Blue Daisy had caught his attention online, nearly 5 stars across all review sites, with people raving about their famous apple pie and home-style cooking. His stomach growled as if on cue. He hadn't eaten since a quick sandwich at a gas station around noon. The restaurant's blue awning fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, and warm yellow light spilled from the windows onto the sidewalk. Through the glass, he could see families and couples enjoying their meals, their faces lit with conversation and laughter. It looked exactly like the cozy place he had hoped to find. As James pulled open the heavy wooden door, a small bell jingled above his head. The rich smell of roasting meat and baking bread hit him immediately. The restaurant was busier than he'd expected for a Thursday night. A playlist of soft folk music hummed underneath the buzz of conversation. An old jukebox stood in the corner, though it wasn't currently playing. He noticed the decor right away. Old black and white photographs of the town lined the walls, mixed with colorful local artwork. The tables were real wood, not the veneer kind you'd find in chain restaurants. Whoever owned this place clearly cared about it. James hadn't felt this relaxed in months. Back home, his phone would be buzzing with client messages and deadline reminders. Here, nobody knew him. He was just another traveler passing through, with nothing more pressing to do than enjoy a good meal and maybe take a walk afterward to see the town's famous clock tower lit up at night. A heavy-set man with a gray beard nodded at him from behind the bar, where he was mixing some kind of bright blue cocktail. 2 older women at a corner table looked up briefly as he entered, then returned to their animated conversation. A young couple with a toddler smiled as the little boy waved a spoon in James' direction. He stood by the "Please wait to be seated" sign, taking in the atmosphere while waiting for someone to notice him. His eyes drifted to the specials board, where Marianne's famous pot roast was written in colorful chalk alongside blueberry cobbler with homemade ice cream. This was exactly what he needed. Good food in a warm place where he could simply exist without expectations or deadlines. His week-long vacation stretched ahead of him like a gift. He planned to visit the Historical Society tomorrow, then maybe drive out to the famous covered bridges in the afternoon. James didn't know it yet, but this ordinary dinner in this ordinary small-town restaurant was about to become a moment that would change not only his vacation, but the entire town of Millfield. As he stood there, taking in the sights and sounds of the Blue Daisy, a waitress named Melissa had just spotted him from across the room, and her reaction would set in motion events that no one could have predicted. Melissa had been working the dinner shift at the Blue Daisy for 3 years now. Most locals knew her as the waitress with the butterfly tattoo on her wrist and the quick, sometimes too sharp laugh. Tonight, she moved between tables with the easy confidence of someone who knew the menu by heart and could balance 5 plates on one arm without blinking. "How's everything tasting, Mr. and Mrs. Chen?" she asked, stopping by a corner table where an elderly couple was sharing a slice of cherry pie. They'd been coming every Thursday for as long as anyone could remember. "Delicious as always, dear," Mrs. Chen replied, patting Melissa's hand. Melissa's smile was genuine as she refilled their water glasses. That smile, however, faded as her gaze drifted toward the entrance where James now stood. Something in her posture shifted. A slight stiffening of her shoulders, a tightening around her mouth. She placed the water pitcher down with a little too much force, causing a nearby diner to look up. "I'll get him," she said to no one in particular, though her co-worker Danny raised an eyebrow. Danny had been about to head that way herself. As Melissa approached James, her usual greeting, the cheerful welcome to the Blue Daisy that she offered to most guests, was noticeably absent. Instead, she grabbed a single menu from the stack, holding it like it was slightly heavier than usual. "Just you?" she asked, her voice carrying none of the warmth it had held just moments before with the Chens. James nodded, offering a friendly smile. "Yes, just me. I'm in town for a little vacation. The Blue Daisy came highly recommended online." Melissa didn't return his smile. "Follow me," she said, turning without waiting to see if he followed. James noticed the row of empty tables by the large bay windows, the best seats in the house with a view of the town square and its twinkling lights. "Could I possibly sit by the window?" he asked. "I'd love to see more of the town while I eat." Melissa stopped mid-stride. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to din for a moment. "Those tables are for our regular customers," she said, loud enough that a nearby family glanced over. "Reserved." James looked toward the tables. There were no reserved signs in sight. 2 other parties had been seated at window tables since he'd arrived, neither seeming to be greeted as regulars. "Oh, I see," he said, maintaining his polite tone. "No problem at all." Melissa led him to a table in the back, close to the swinging kitchen doors where servers bustled in and out. A bus bin filled with dirty dishes sat on a stand barely 3 feet away. Every few minutes, the kitchen doors would swing open, sending a blast of hot air and loud clattering sounds toward his table. "Someone will be with you shortly," Melissa said, dropping the menu on the table before walking away quickly. James picked up the menu, trying not to let his confusion show. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe he'd misunderstood something about how this restaurant worked. He decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. James watched as Melissa welcomed a group of 4 who'd arrived after him, guiding them to one of the window tables he'd been told were reserved. She laughed at something one of them said, her whole demeanor transformed from how she'd acted with him. Families seated after him already had their water glasses filled, bread baskets delivered, and orders taken. Yet his table remained empty except for the slightly sticky menu. Every time he tried to catch Melissa's eye, she seemed to find something urgent to do in the opposite direction. A young server, Dunny, according to her name tag, noticed him looking around and frowned slightly, saying something to Melissa that James couldn't hear. James checked his watch. 20 minutes had passed since he'd been seated. His initial excitement about this meal was fading, replaced by an uncomfortable feeling in his stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. He'd traveled enough to recognize what was happening, though he hoped, naively perhaps, that he wouldn't encounter it in this charming town that had looked so welcoming from the outside. He considered leaving, finding another restaurant, avoiding the confrontation that seemed to be brewing. But something kept him in his seat, maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe just the simple belief that he deserved to eat at this restaurant just like anyone else. When Melissa finally approached his table again, the look on her face made it clear this was about to get worse before it got better. James took a sip from the water glass he had finally received, not from Melissa, but from Dunny, who had noticed his empty table and quietly dropped it off with an apologetic smile. The water was lukewarm, without the lemon slices and ice that adorned other tables' glasses. Small things, but they added up. The kitchen doors swung open again, blasting hot air and the sound of clattering dishes. A cook shouted something about a missing order, and Melissa shouted back. James winced as the doors swung shut, only to open again seconds later as a server rushed out with plates balanced up their arm. The family at the table closest to him, parents with 2 small children, were already cutting into their steaming meals despite having arrived a full 15 minutes after him. The children's laughter mingled with the clinking of forks against plates and the low hum of conversation that filled the rest of the dining room. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten properly all day, looking forward to this meal. Now, almost 30 minutes had passed, and he still hadn't placed his order. "Excuse me," he said, raising his hand slightly as Melissa passed nearby with a coffee pot. She looked directly at him, then turned away as if she hadn't seen him. He watched her stop at 3 other tables, refilling cups and chatting with customers. The older couple who had been seated near the entrance, The Chens, he thought he'd heard Melissa call them, were now paying their bill. They'd arrived before him, eaten an entire meal, and were leaving, while he sat with nothing but warm water. James took a deep breath. He'd faced situations like this before: the slow service, the convenient forgetting, the subtle messages that he wasn't welcome. Usually he let it go. Life was too short, and confrontations rarely change people's hearts. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion from his drive. Maybe it was seeing how warmly Melissa treated everyone else. Or maybe it was simply reaching his limit. When Melissa passed by again, he spoke louder. "Excuse me, I'd like to order." This time she couldn't pretend not to hear him. Several nearby diners glanced over. Trapped, she approached his table with visible reluctance, her notepad held like a shield. "What do you want?" she asked, not bothering with the ready to order, or "what can I get you?" That James had heard her use with other tables. "I'd like to order," he repeated calmly. "But first, could I ask why I've been waiting for 30 minutes when people who came in after me have already gotten their food?" Melissa's face flushed. "Kitchen's backed up," she said flatly. James gestured toward the family eating nearby. They seemed to have gotten their food just fine. The restaurant had grown quieter. A few people at nearby tables were obviously listening now, their conversations paused mid-sentence. "Look," Melissa said, her voice rising slightly, "we're busy tonight. You people are always so demanding." The air in the restaurant seemed to freeze. An older man at a nearby table set down his fork with a sharp clink. The mother at the family table covered her younger child's ears, her eyes wide. "You people," James repeated, his voice steady despite the sudden hammering of his heart. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Melissa's eyes narrowed. She looked around, perhaps just realizing how many people were watching, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "You know exactly what I mean," she said, loud enough now that even tables across the restaurant could hear. "Your type always wants special treatment, always complaining, always making a scene. And you never tip well anyway." The restaurant fell completely silent. Someone gasped. A glass was set down too hard somewhere in the back. James felt a familiar rush of emotions: anger, embarrassment, weariness, but kept his face neutral. He'd learned long ago that showing any reaction would only reinforce the stereotypes people like Melissa already believed. "I see," he said quietly. He had two choices: leave and find somewhere else to eat, or stay and address what was happening. Around him, he could feel the attention of every diner in the Blue Daisy. Some looked uncomfortable, some seemed shocked, and others, like the young couple by the window, who were now whispering furiously to each other, appeared outright angry. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about whether this type of behavior would go unchallenged in a public place in front of all these witnesses. James carefully folded his napkin and placed it beside his untouched water glass. When he spoke again, his voice was clear and measured, carrying through the silent restaurant. "I don't know what experiences have shaped your views," he said, looking directly at Melissa, "but I'd appreciate being treated with the same respect you give to every other customer here." What happened next would change everything. The silence hanging over the Blue Daisy was thick enough to touch. Melissa stood frozen, her order pad clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. For a moment, it seemed she might apologize. A flash of something like doubt crossed her face, but then her jaw set stubbornly. "I treat everyone how they deserve to be treated," she shot back, doubling down. "I've been serving tables for 7 years. I know what I'm talking about." James felt every eye in the restaurant on him. The weight of their stares pressed against his skin. He'd faced moments like this before, at stores where security followed him too closely, at business meetings where his ideas were questioned more harshly than his colleagues, at high-end hotels where staff assumed he was in the wrong place. Usually he let it go, not because it didn't hurt, but because the constant work of confronting every slight was exhausting. But something about today was different. Maybe it was the openness of Melissa's disrespect, or maybe it was the complete stillness of the restaurant around them. Whatever the reason, James decided this moment mattered. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. His voice remained steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. "You don't know that I own an architecture firm in Chicago. You don't know that I came to this town because I admire its historical buildings. You don't know that I've been driving all day and was looking forward to this meal because nearly 50 online reviews said this place treats everyone like family. He paused, letting his words settle across the room. The only thing you know about me is what I look like. And you decided that was enough to treat me worse than anyone else here. Melissa's face flushed deep red. That's not, I wasn't. She stammered, suddenly aware of how many people were watching. You're twisting my words. Am I? James asked. You called me you people. You said my type never tips well. What exactly did you mean by that, if not the color of my skin? The question hung in the air. No one moved. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped, the cook and dishwasher now standing in the doorway watching. Melissa looked around, perhaps hoping for support, but found none. Even the customers she'd been serving cheerfully moments ago were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to outright disgust. I didn't, she started, but was cut off by a voice from across the room. That's enough, young lady. An elderly woman with silver hair had risen from her seat at a corner table. Mrs. Chen, the woman James had noticed earlier with her husband, stood straight despite her years, her eyes sharp with disapproval. My husband and I have eaten at this restaurant every Thursday for 20 years, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent dining room. We've watched owners come and go. We've celebrated birthdays and anniversaries here. And never, in all those years, have I been as disappointed as I am right now. Mr. Chen stood beside his wife, nodding in agreement. When we first moved to this town in the 1970s, there were places that didn't want to serve us either, he added. We thought those days were behind us. James felt a rush of unexpected emotion. He'd been prepared to stand alone. He'd done it before. But now, looking at the elderly couple standing tall across the restaurant, he realized he wouldn't have to. A younger man at a table near the door pushed his chair back and stood. My grandparents were immigrants, he said. They faced the same thing. It's not right. Not then, not now. One by one, other diners began to rise. A woman with her teenage daughter, a group of college students, two men who had been having a business dinner. Each face turned toward Melissa, who seemed to shrink with every person who stood. James remained seated, watching in disbelief as nearly half the restaurant rose in silent support. He'd come to Millfield as a stranger, expecting nothing more than a meal and a bed for the night. Instead, he found himself at the center of something he couldn't have imagined, a small town drawing its line in the sand, making clear what it would and wouldn't tolerate. The kitchen doors swung open with force. A stocky man in a chef's apron strode out, his face a thundercloud. The chef who burst through the kitchen doors wasn't tall, but he filled the room with his presence. A white apron stretched across his broad chest, splattered with sauce stains from a busy dinner service. His thick eyebrows drew together as he surveyed the scene. Half the diners standing, Melissa frozen in place, and James still seated calmly at his table. What in God's name is going on out here? He demanded, his deep voice bouncing off the walls. I can hear you all the way back in the kitchen. No one spoke for a moment. Then 3 people started talking at once, Mr. Chen from his spot near the window, a young woman from the table by the door, and an older man seated with his family. Their voices overlapped as they tried to explain what had happened. The chef held up a flour-dusted hand. One at a time, please, he said, then pointed to Dani, the other waitress who had been watching everything unfold. You, what happened? Dani glanced nervously at Melissa, then straightened her shoulders. Pete, she hesitated, then continued. Melissa said some really inappropriate things to this customer. She gestured toward James. Called him you people and said his type never tips well. Wouldn't serve him properly. Everyone heard it. Pete, apparently the chef and owner, turned to face Melissa. Is this true? Melissa's face had gone from red to pale. You don't understand. He was being difficult. He wasn't, interrupted the mother from the family seated nearby. Her children watched wide-eyed as she spoke up. We came in after him, and we've already finished our main course. He's been sitting there with nothing but water. We all saw it. And then when he finally asked about it, the woman glanced at her children and chose her words carefully. She made it very clear why she was treating him differently. Pete's expression darkened. He turned to James, his tone completely changed. "Sir, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am. This is my restaurant. I'm Pete Donovan, the owner." James nodded. "James Williams," he replied simply. "Mr. Williams, the Blue Daisy has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandmother opened it in 1962, and she had one rule above all others. Everyone who walks through that door is treated with respect." Pete ran a hand through his graying hair. "What happened here tonight goes against everything this place stands for." The restaurant remained unusually quiet. Even the children seemed to understand something important was happening. Pete turned back to Melissa. "Get your things and go home. Come by tomorrow to pick up your final check." Melissa's mouth fell open. "You're firing me. Just like that? Over one customer?" "No," Pete said firmly. "I'm firing you because you violated the most basic principle of this restaurant. And from what I'm seeing and hearing, it wasn't just one customer, it was blatant discrimination. Something I won't tolerate, not for a minute." Melissa looked around the room, perhaps hoping someone would defend her, but she found no allies. Even her regular customers were watching her with disappointment in their eyes. Without another word, she untied her apron, threw it on the floor, and stormed toward the back, shoving through the kitchen doors. The tension in the room eased slightly, but an uncomfortable silence remained. People slowly began to sit back down, exchanging glances and quiet words. Pete turned back to James. "Mr. Williams, your meal tonight is on the house. In fact, if you're staying in town, all your meals are on the house." James shook his head gently. "That's not necessary." "It is to me," Pete insisted. "What happened here tonight isn't what this town is about." He looked around at the other diners. "At least I didn't think it was." To everyone's surprise, James smiled. "Based on what I've seen in the last 5 minutes, I'd say you're right. It isn't what this town is about." As if his words had broken a spell, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. The college students who had stood up came over to introduce themselves. The Chen couple made their way across the room to shake James's hand. The family with the young children asked if he'd like to join their table. What had begun as an ugly incident was transforming into something unexpected. People who had been strangers moments before were now talking, sharing stories, making connections. Pete watched it unfold, then called to the kitchen, "Roy, cook up the best steak in the house. And Lisa, bring out a bottle of the good red wine." For the first time since he'd entered the Blue Daisy, James felt truly welcome. But no one in the restaurant, not even James himself, could have predicted what would happen next. The next hour at the Blue Daisy passed in a way James could never have imagined when he first walked through the door. Instead of eating alone at the back table by the kitchen, he now sat at a large table in the center of the restaurant. Pete had pushed together 3 tables to make room for everyone who wanted to join him. The Chens sat to his right, Mr. Chen sharing stories about opening his pharmacy in town back in 1975. "Not everyone was welcoming then," he said quietly. "But the good people outnumbered the others. They always do eventually." Across from James sat Dani, who had apologized repeatedly for not stepping in sooner. "I should have said something the minute I saw how she was treating you," she said, her eyes sincere. "I was just so shocked. In the 3 years I've worked here, I never knew Melissa was like that." "Sometimes people hide parts of themselves," James replied. "Until they don't." A middle-aged couple who introduced themselves as the Washingtons had pulled up chairs too. The husband taught history at the local high school, and his eyes lit up when James mentioned his interest in the town's architecture. "You absolutely must see the old courthouse tomorrow," he insisted, writing down directions on a napkin. "The stonework is incredible, and they've preserved the original woodwork from 1892. His wife added, "And if you're interested, I'm on the Historical Preservation Committee. We're meeting tomorrow afternoon. You'd be welcome to join us." The college students, 3 young women who attended the nearby community college, asked thoughtful questions about James's architecture firm and his projects in Chicago. One of them was studying design and scribbled her email address on another napkin, asking if she could send in her portfolio for advice. Pete hadn't been joking about the steak. It arrived perfectly cooked, accompanied by roasted potatoes that smelled of rosemary and garlic. The promised bottle of the good red wine turned out to be 2 bottles shared among the impromptu gathering. "I still can't believe this," James said at one point, looking around at the faces of people who had been strangers just an hour ago. I almost left when I realized what was happening. I'm glad you didn't, said Mrs. Chen, patting his hand the same way she'd patted Melissa's earlier in the evening. The contrast wasn't lost on James. As the evening progressed, more stories emerged. The Washingtons talked about their daughter, who faced similar treatment at a store in the neighboring town. One of the college students, whose parents had immigrated from Honduras, shared her own experiences with prejudice. The family with young children had been quiet at first, but eventually the father spoke up about a workplace incident that had opened his eyes to biases he hadn't noticed before. What had started as an ugly moment of discrimination had somehow turned into a community conversation, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. By the time dessert arrived, Pete's special blueberry cobbler with homemade vanilla ice cream, the atmosphere in the Blue Daisy felt entirely different than it had when James first walked in. Laughter flowed freely, and the initial tension had dissolved into something much warmer. You know, Pete said, pulling up a chair after finally hanging up his apron, my grandmother used to say that food brings people together, but it's really the tables where the magic happens. People sitting face to face, talking instead of shouting, listening instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. As the evening wound down and people began to say their goodbyes, James found himself with a collection of phone numbers, email addresses, and invitations. The town that had felt so foreign just hours ago now seemed filled with potential connections. The Washingtons insisted on showing him the historic district tomorrow. Mrs. Chen made him promise to stop by the pharmacy to see the old soda fountain they'd preserved. The youngest college student asked if he'd speak to her design class about urban architecture. What had begun as a simple dinner had somehow turned into something much more meaningful. And as James finally stepped out of the Blue Daisy into the cool night air, he realized his vacation had taken an unexpected turn, one that might lead to connections far more lasting than he could have imagined. But this wasn't just the end of an uncomfortable evening turned surprisingly good. Unknown to James, as he walked back to his hotel under the stars, events were already in motion that would extend far beyond his week-long vacation in Millfield. 6 months had passed since that evening at the Blue Daisy. The maple trees lining Millfield's main street were showing their first hints of autumn color as James Williams parked his car in the now familiar spot outside the restaurant. This time, he wasn't a tourist but a returning friend. James had originally planned to leave Millfield the morning after the incident. Instead, he'd stayed the entire week, guided through the town's historic district by the Washingtons, shown the best hiking trails by the college students, and even invited to sit in on the Historical Preservation Committee meeting, where his professional expertise had been warmly welcomed. Before leaving, he'd exchanged contact information with more people than he could have imagined. What had started as a simple vacation had somehow planted seeds for ongoing connections. Now, as he pushed open the door of the Blue Daisy, the familiar bell jingled above his head. The restaurant looked different, new curtains hung in the windows, the walls had been repainted a warm yellow, and the seating had been rearranged to create a more open, welcoming space. James, Pete's voice boomed from behind the counter. The chef's apron was as splattered as ever, but his smile was bright. Right on time. The restaurant was closed to regular customers this evening. Instead, tables had been arranged in a large circle with about 20 people already seated. Some faces James recognized from his previous visit. The Chens, the Washingtons, Danny the waitress. Others were new to him. Our guest of honor has arrived, Pete announced, pulling out a chair at what appeared to be the head of the circle. Mrs. Chen approached with a small bouquet of flowers. Welcome back, she said, handing them to James. We've been looking forward to this day. James took his seat, genuinely moved by the warm reception. I still can't believe all this came from such an unpleasant beginning, he said, looking around at the gathered faces. Mr. Washington, the history teacher, leaned forward. Sometimes the most important changes start from difficult moments, he said. After you left, this town had some hard conversations that were long overdue. Those conversations had started at the Blue Daisy itself. Pete had turned the restaurant into a meeting place where people could talk openly about experiences with prejudice and discrimination, not just in big cities, but right here in their small town. We're calling it Community Table, explained a woman James hadn't met before, who introduced herself as the town librarian. "Once a month, we meet to talk about how to make Millfield truly welcoming for everyone." "And not just talk," added Pete. "We're backing it up with action." The actions had been concrete. The local business association had adopted a new code of conduct. The high school had expanded its curriculum to include more diverse perspectives in history and literature. The town council had created a community welcome committee for new residents, regardless of their background. Even the Blue Daisy itself had changed. Pete had hired 2 new staff members from backgrounds underrepresented in Millfield. The menu now featured dishes from various cultural traditions, with stories about their origins printed alongside the descriptions. "What about Melissa?" James asked quietly. He'd wondered about the waitress often in the months since that night. Pete exchanged glances with Danny. "That's actually one of the most surprising parts," Danny said. "About a month after everything happened, she came back, not asking for her job, just wanting to talk to Pete. She apologized," Pete explained. "Said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about her behavior that night and throughout her life. Said she wanted to make changes." "Is she here tonight?" James asked, looking around the room. Pete shook his head. "No, she moved to her sister's place in another state. But before she left, she wrote something for our community board." He gestured toward a cork board near the entrance, where various notices and photos were pinned. Later that evening, James read the note, a simple but sincere apology, acknowledging harm done and lessons learned. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was something real. As the evening progressed, James shared his own news. He purchased a small weekend cottage just outside town. His architecture firm had even taken on the restoration of Millfield's historic theater as a project. "I came here as a stranger," James said when they asked him to say a few words. "I found something I wasn't expecting, not just a pretty town with nice buildings, but a community willing to face hard truths and grow from them." Outside the windows of the Blue Daisy, the sun was setting over Millfield, casting golden light across the town square. What had begun as one ugly moment had somehow sparked something beautiful, proof that even in the darkest situations, human connection could shine through.